If you are alone for a long time, soon you will. Daniel Hayes had always considered himself an introvert, even when he was younger. In college, he was the kind of guy who would go to a party, smile politely, exchange a few words, and then quietly slip away before the crowd got too loud. It wasn't that he disliked people, he just felt more at peace in his own company. But back then, solitude was a choice, not a condition. He had friends, a girlfriend, and a busy enough life to keep loneliness at bay. Things were different now. At 38, Daniel lived in a modest two-story house at the far end of Willow Lane in the small town of Ashwood, where neighbors still waved at each other and grocery store cashiers knew your name. His home was comfortable but sparsely decorated, the walls painted in neutral shades, as though he had been waiting for someone else's touch before committing to any real personality. The silence inside wasn't oppressive, it was just there. Constant. It had been 6 years since his divorce from Emily. They had been married for 8 years, and though their split had been civil, it left Daniel with a kind of emptiness that no amount of work could fill. At first, he kept himself busy with freelance graphic design projects. He told himself he'd take time to heal, to figure out who he was without her. But time had stretched into years, and without realizing it, he had built a routine so quiet and predictable that entire weeks could pass without meaningful human contact. Most days started the same way. He'd wake up, brew coffee, check emails, and work until the sky outside shifted from blue to pink to black. Meals were often simple: sandwiches, takeout Chinese, or reheated pasta from the night before. Music sometimes played in the background, but more often, it was just the soft whir of his computer fan. One Sunday morning in early autumn, Daniel sat at his kitchen table staring into a half-empty coffee mug. Outside, golden leaves scattered across the street, carried by a crisp breeze. His phone buzzed with a text from his younger sister, Sarah. "Sarah, dinner at our place Thursday. No excuses this time." Daniel smirked faintly. Sarah had been persistent over the years, inviting him to family dinners, game nights, and barbecues. He'd attended a few early on after the divorce, but gradually, the invitations became easier to decline. He always had a reason: too much work, not feeling well, maybe next week. He typed back a non-committal, "I'll see," and set the phone down. It was strange how the mind adjusted to absence. In the early years, he'd felt restless in the quiet, reaching for the phone just to hear another voice. But as time went on, the silence became familiar, even safe. And safety, Daniel realized, was addictive. That afternoon, he decided to take a walk to clear his head. He ended up at Ashwood Park, a place he and Emily had visited often when they were still together. The trees lining the pathways had grown taller, casting longer shadows. The bench where they used to sit and watch the ducks was still there, though the paint had chipped and the wood looked worn. Near the pond, he saw families gathered, kids tossing breadcrumbs to ducks, parents chatting, a teenager playing guitar under a tree. He lingered on the path, watching from a distance, feeling an odd mixture of warmth and longing. He chose an empty bench and sat down, letting the late afternoon sun warm his face. A few minutes later, an elderly man with a cane approached and asked if he could sit. "Of course," Daniel said, sliding over. The man introduced himself as George. His hair was white, his hands weathered, and his eyes carried the weight of stories untold. They struck up a conversation about the weather, the park, and eventually life. Daniel learned that George had been coming to this park every day since his wife passed 5 years ago. "You know," George said after a pause, "if you're alone for a long time, you start building walls around yourself. At first, you think you're protecting yourself. But before you know it, those walls don't just keep people out, they keep you in." Daniel thought about that long after George left. That night, lying in bed, he replayed the words in his mind. Was that what he had done? Built walls so high that even he couldn't climb out? He pictured his life as it was now: work, sleep, repeat, and realized that the routines he thought kept him safe had actually kept him stuck. The next morning, he made a decision. It wasn't dramatic, just a small shift. He would go to Sarah's dinner on Thursday. He wouldn't overthink it or make excuses. When Thursday came, Daniel drove to Sarah's house feeling oddly nervous. The moment he walked in, he was greeted by the warm smell of lasagna and the sound of laughter. Sarah's husband, Mark, shook his hand firmly, and their kids, Lucy and Ben, ran up to hug him. At first, Daniel felt out of place, unsure how to fit into the easy flow of conversation. But as the night went on, he found himself laughing at Ben's soccer stories and complimenting Lucy's drawing skills. Over dessert, Sarah looked at him with a knowing smile. "You know, you don't have to be a stranger," she teased. "Maybe I've been away too long," he admitted. In the weeks that followed, Daniel tried to keep saying yes, to coffee with an old friend, to joining Sarah's family at the local fair, to signing up for a photography group he saw advertised at the library. On Saturdays, instead of staying inside, he took his camera and wandered through town, capturing candid moments, a couple sharing ice cream on a bench, a street musician playing the saxophone, children chasing bubbles in the park. There were still days when solitude pulled at him, whispering that it was easier to stay home. But he remembered George's words and pushed himself to step outside. Slowly, the walls began to crumble. Months later, he spotted George again at the park, sitting on their old bench. "You were right," Daniel said, sitting beside him. "About what?" George asked with a small smile. "The walls. I think I've started taking them down." George chuckled. "Good. Life's too short to live behind them." Daniel realized then that the greatest change in his life hadn't come from some grand gesture, but from a choice, a simple decision to step back into the world, even if it felt uncomfortable at first. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel so heavy anymore.